And at this point, we get some news, because the prosecutors from Mueller's office, they bring up to the judge, unprompted, the case that we learned about yesterday, and we had wondered if this was going to come up in Flynn's sentencing today. This is the case, just unsealed yesterday, where Flynn's longtime business partner was charged with multiple felonies. This is somebody who was also a Trump transition official. He was the vice chairman of Flynn's intelligence group, and he was charged yesterday with being part of a scheme, along with Mike Flynn, person A in that indictment. He's charged with being part of a scheme, basically, to operate secretly in this country as paid foreign agents of the government of Turkey, without ever disclosing it. So the prosecutors from Mueller's office bring that up to the judge today, as if that should help Flynn even more. Look, he helped us get that indictment, too. He's been super helpful. He's a great cooperator. But the judge immediately boomerangs that back at them by saying, basically, yeah, I see how he helped you get that indictment filed, but Flynn participated in the crime that is laid out in that indictment, too. I mean, the judge says, you know, looking at the evidence of what Flynn himself did in that alleged crime, you could have charged him for that. You could have locked him up for that, too, right? I mean, here's how it goes. Prosecutor Brandon Van Grack. Quote, we'd like to bring to the court's attention that we just had an indictment unsealed in the Eastern District of Virginia, charging Bijan Kian and Akeem Alptekin with various violations. And the defendant provided substantial assistance to the attorneys in the Eastern District of Virginia in obtaining that charging document. The judge, all right, could the defendant have been indicted in that indictment? Could he have been charged in that indictment? Prosecutor Brandon Van Grack, and Your Honor, the answer is yes. The judge says, your answer is he could have been charged in that indictment, Mr. Van Grack. Yes, Your Honor. They then talk about how many years in prison Mike Flynn could have received just for that crime if he had been charged and convicted in that case that was unsealed yesterday in Virginia. The judge concludes that discussion by saying, quote, the exposure for Flynn would have been grave then. Exposure to Mr. Flynn would have been significant had he been indicted, meaning he could have potentially received many years in prison. Mr. Van Grack, the prosecutor, says, yes, Your Honor. So that is a remarkable moment. That's the prosecutors trying to help Flynn out here. I mean, they're prosecuting Flynn, but they're trying to help him out. They're telling the judge, hey, he helped us out in this other case. And the judge, in response, makes the prosecutors spell out how guilty Flynn might have been in that felony criminal case, too. So things are not going well for Michael Flynn here. You should also know that the effort by Flynn and his lawyers over recent days to argue, heading into today's sentencing, that Flynn was kind of the victim here, that he didn't really mean to lie to the FBI. The FBI somehow tricked him or unfairly boxed him in to lying inadvertently. They tried that a little bit in the document that they submitted to the judge about Flynn's sentencing in advance of today's hearing. That argument really did not go well today. And that's important even beyond just the fate of Mike Flynn, because this has become a real cause célèbre, particularly in conservative media. It was even trumpeted today from the White House by White House spokeswoman Sarah Sanders, who repeated those claims essentially about Flynn, in her words, being ambushed by the FBI, as if Flynn didn't really lie, or if he did, it wasn't his fault. It should be noted that the judge in Flynn's case just destroyed that argument today. He forced Flynn and Flynn's lawyers to disavow any claim to that argument, and ultimately Flynn's lawyer even apologized to the judge for raising it at all. The judge, quote, do you believe the FBI had a legal obligation to warn Mr. Flynn that lying to the FBI was a federal crime? Mr. Kellner, the defense lawyer, no, Your Honor. The judge, is it your contention that Mr. Flynn was entrapped by the FBI? Kellner, the defense lawyer, no, Your Honor. The judge, do you believe Mr. Flynn's rights were violated by the fact that he didn't have a lawyer present for the interview? No, Your Honor. Do you believe his rights were violated by the fact that he may have been dissuaded from having a lawyer present for the interview? No, Your Honor. The judge says the sentencing memorandum also states that Mr. Flynn pled guilty before certain revelations that certain FBI officials involved in the interview were themselves being investigated for misconduct. Is it your contention that any misconduct by any member of the FBI raises any degree of doubt that Mr. Flynn intentionally lied to the FBI? Kellner, the defense attorney, no, Your Honor. The references that I've mentioned that appear in your sentencing memorandum raise some concerns on the part of the court. And my question is, how is raising those contentions about the circumstances under which Mr. Flynn lied consistent with his acceptance of responsibility? Later on in the proceedings, this is where Flynn's lawyer essentially decides to take responsibility for that himself and basically apologize to the court for having raised it. The judge says, quote, the defense lawyer says to the judge, quote, "Let me make very clear, Your Honor, that the decisions regarding how to frame General Flynn's sentencing memorandum made by counsel, made by me, made by Mr. Anthony, the other defense counsel, those decisions are entirely ours and really should not and do not diminish in any way General Flynn's acceptance of responsibility in this case." And the judge then sort of interrupts and says, "The point is well taken, but you understand why I had to make the inquiry?" Defense lawyer says, "I do." The judge says, "Because I'm thinking this sounds like a backpedaling on the acceptance of responsibility." So that did not work. Mike Flynn and his attorneys today disavow and essentially apologize for ever suggesting to the judge that Flynn wasn't really guilty, that the FBI was somehow the real culprit here. I mean, that alone cancels like half the shows on Fox News tonight. Right? What are you going to talk about? But there's also the part where everybody starts talking about Mike Flynn and treason, and they can't stop saying the word treason over and over again. That's next, and there's actually some news there that may not make the judge very happy in this case. Stay with us. Here's the part about treason in today's aborted sentencing hearing for Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. So this all happens right after the judge has just ripped a hole in Mike Flynn and said out loud in open court that arguably, Mike Flynn, you sold out your country. You betrayed the flag that he turned and pointed to in the courtroom. So the judge has just done that. Flynn has just sat down. And then the judge starts directing questions to Mueller's prosecutors. And they are questions that appear to shock even the prosecutors. The judge says, quote, "Counsel, these are questions, answers to which the court's going to consider in attempting to determine an appropriate sentence. The conversation with the Russian ambassador in December, is that a violation of law?" Prosecutor Brandon Van Grack, "Your Honor." The judge, "I hate to be so blunt. Could he have been charged with a criminal offense?" Mr. Van Grack, "Let me answer two ways." The judge, "Okay." Van Grack, which is the facts could potentially support a violation of the Logan Act, which I think is perhaps what the court is referring to. The judge, "Is that the act that no one has ever been prosecuted under?" Mr. Van Grack, "That's right, which is why I want to be clear in terms of the government's consideration of potential charges against General Flynn. That is not one of the charges the government was considering." Again, the Logan Act is about private citizens basically conducting foreign policy negotiations that undermine the sitting government of the United States. Here's prosecutors saying they were not considering those kinds of charges against Flynn. The judge says, "Okay, fair enough, good, that's the answer I wanted." Then the judge continues, "Were there other charges that could have been brought against Mr. Flynn, other than FARA violations or false statements?" I'm not minimizing either one of those. Van Grack, the prosecutor, says, "The government's statement of offense represents a representation of the unlawful activity that the government believes the defendant committed in terms of beyond a reasonable doubt." The judge, "All right. I really don't know the answer to this question," he says, "but given the fact that the then President of the United States imposed sanctions against Russia for interfering with federal elections in this country, is there an opinion about the conduct of the defendant in the following days that rises to the level of treasonous activity on his part?" Van Grack, the prosecutor, says, "The government did not consider, I shouldn't say did not consider, but in terms of the evidence that the government had at the time, that was not something that we were considering in terms of charging the defendant." The judge says, "All right. Hypothetically, could he have been charged with treason?" Van Grack, the prosecutor, "Your Honor, I want to be careful what I represent." The judge, "Sure." Van Grack, "And not having that information in front of me, and because it's such a serious question, I am hesitant to answer it." Gulp. Now, after a recess a few minutes later, the judge came back from the recess and cautioned everyone that when he asked that question, could he be charged with treason, he charged, even though he said that in court, he came back and cautioned everybody in the courtroom that he wasn't suggesting that there should be treason charges against Mike Flynn. He was just wondering about the possibility of that. The judge, after the recess, quote, "I wasn't suggesting he's committed treason. I wasn't suggesting he committed violations. I was just curious as to whether or not he could have been charged." And I gave a few examples. And you know, there are a lot of conspiracy theorists out there. I'm not taking the elements of any of the uncharged offenses into consideration at the time of sentencing. I was just trying to determine the benefit of and the generosity of the government in bestowing a benefit on Mr. Flynn. That was the reason why. Prosecutor Van Grack, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge. And I said early on, don't read too much into the questions I ask. But I'm not suggesting he committed treason. I just asked a legitimate question. Van Grack, the prosecutor, "Yes, Your Honor." And that affords us an opportunity to clarify something on our end, which is, with respect to treason, I said I wanted to make sure I had the statute in front of me. The government has no reason to believe that the defendant committed treason. Which means today was the day in U.S. history when the prosecutors had to go and check the statute in writing at the judge's suggestion so they could return to court and aver that, no, they're not planning on charging the president's first national security advisor with treason. But thank you, Your Honor, for the suggestion. And you know what? It's actually pretty good to have looked it up.